Picture this. After a long day at work, you finally pull into your driveway. The neighborhood is quiet, the night sky heavy with silence. You grab your briefcase, walk up the steps, and slide the key into the lock of your own front door. But before you can even turn the knob, bright red and blue lights explode behind you. Step away from the door, hands where we can see them. The command cuts through the night. Confused, you try to explain. You reach for your ID, point to the family photo framed in the living room window, proof that this is your home, your sanctuary, but none of it matters. To them, you're not a husband coming home. You're not a father about to kiss his children goodnight. To them, you're just another suspect. In seconds, cold metal cuffs bite into your wrists. Your wife's voice cracks as she begs for reason. Your children's cries echo into the night, but the officers don't flinch. You're shoved into the back of a squad car, humiliated on the very doorstep of the life you built. What the officers don't know is that the man they've just arrested isn't a criminal. He's a lawyer. More than that, he's one of the very architects of the laws those officers are sworn to uphold. And this brutal irony, the law itself dragged away in chains, is only the beginning of this story. Opening scene. The night was still, the kind of quiet suburban evening when families gather around the dinner table and children drift off to sleep. The man walked up the driveway, his briefcase heavy in one hand, the faint glow of the porch light guiding his steps. Home, safety, the place where he belonged. But before the key even turned in the lock, headlights cut through the dark. Red and blue strobes shattered the silence. A voice thundered, "Step away from the door, hands where we can see them." He froze. For a moment he thought it was some mistake, maybe the wrong house, maybe someone else entirely. But no, the commands were aimed directly at him. He raised his hands, his voice trembling but calm. "This is my house, please, I live here, let me show you." The words didn't matter. Flashlights blinded his eyes, and in seconds, rough hands pulled his arms behind his back. The cold snap of handcuffs bit into his wrists. From inside, a scream. His wife rushed to the door, pleading with officers who refused to meet her eyes. His children pressed their faces against the window, watching as their father, the man who tucked them in every night, was shoved into the back of a police cruiser like a criminal. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains. A dog barked down the street. And in the middle of it all, he sat in the squad car humiliated, his dignity stripped away in front of the very people he loved most. The officers barked accusations that he didn't belong, that he looked suspicious, that he must be lying. They never asked his name. They never paused long enough to listen. And yet, had they taken even a second, they would have realized who he was. This was no stranger, no intruder. This was a man who had spent his life shaping justice, crafting the very rules those officers were sworn to protect. The man in chains was not a criminal. He was a lawyer. More than that, he was one of the architects of the laws they claimed to enforce. The irony was brutal. The symbol of justice bound in cuffs, the defender of rights, silenced on his own doorstep. The image lingered. A man shackled before his family, his neighbors, his community, treated as guilty before he could ever prove his innocence. No one knew in that moment that this humiliation would ignite a fire, that this night would become a turning point, that the very system that tried to break him would, in time, be forced to reckon with the truth. Because this was not just any arrest. This was the beginning of a story that would expose the deep cracks in American justice. Who Marcus Carter? Marcus Carter wasn't born with privilege. He grew up in a modest neighborhood in a city that thrived on opportunity, but still carried the weight of systemic inequity. His parents worked tirelessly, his mother as a nurse, his father as a factory mechanic, to provide for him and his two younger siblings. Money was always tight, but their home was filled with lessons that would shape Marcus's character: respect, resilience, and an unshakable belief in justice. From a young age, Marcus noticed the disparities around him. He watched friends and neighbors struggle under unfair systems, teachers who expected less from them, cops who treated them differently, and institutions that rarely gave them a chance. While other kids his age played freely, Marcus spent hours in the local library, devouring books on law, history, and civil rights. He became fascinated not just with the idea of justice, but with the power of the law to change lives. High school wasn't easy. Marcus was often the only black student in advanced classes, constantly aware of the expectations and prejudices of both peers and educators. He learned to navigate subtle microaggressions, to hold his head high even when assumptions were made about him before he spoke a single word. And yet, he thrived. His intellect, determination, and quiet leadership earned him the respect of teachers who saw beyond the stereotypes and the envy of classmates who underestimated him. College was another battlefield. Scholarships were hard-fought, professors were often skeptical of his ambitions, and the pressure to succeed weighed heavily on him. But Marcus was relentless. He excelled academically, took on internships, and volunteered in community legal programs, building experience while giving back to the neighborhoods that had raised him. Every late night studying, every challenge he faced only strengthened his resolve. He would become a lawyer who fought for those who were often ignored or dismissed. Law school was the culmination of years of sacrifice. The late nights, the financial struggles, the constant balancing of work and study, it all led to that moment when he walked across the stage to receive his diploma. Marcus Carter was officially a lawyer, a title he carried not with arrogance, but with the solemn promise to use it as a tool for justice. Years later, Marcus became known as a formidable civil rights attorney. His reputation wasn't built on headlines or flashy cases. It was built on countless small victories for people who had no voice, defending tenants, workers, and families who faced injustice every day. Colleagues respected him, clients trusted him, and the community looked up to him not just as a lawyer but as a symbol, proof that perseverance, intellect, and courage could overcome systemic barriers. Yet, despite his success, Marcus never forgot where he came from. He remained humble, approachable, and fiercely protective of his family. The same man who had spent decades crafting arguments for justice would soon find himself confronted with a situation where the very system he understood and helped shape would turn against him. Childhood and dream. Marcus Carter's earliest memories were a mix of warmth and challenge. He grew up in a neighborhood where the streets were lined with aging brick row houses, and the hum of city life never truly quieted. Neighbors knew each other, and kids played basketball in cracked asphalt courts while parents warned them about the world's dangers, both the obvious and the invisible. From a young age, Marcus understood that life would demand more from him than it demanded from others. He saw friends pulled over by police for driving while black even before they had a license. He watched neighbors struggle to find fair treatment at banks, in schools, and at hospitals. Every subtle glance of suspicion, every whispered insult or stereotype, carved lessons into his young mind about the barriers that existed simply because of the color of his skin. But Marcus's parents refused to let him see the world as hopeless. His mother, patient and fierce, would say, "You can't control what others think, Marcus, but you can control what you do." His father, a man of few words but deep wisdom, reminded him that knowledge was the one tool no one could take away. Books became Marcus's refuge and his weapon. He read stories of Thurgood Marshall, Ruby Bridges, and other trailblazers who had faced discrimination head-on and used the law to change lives. Their courage lit a spark in him, a quiet, persistent fire that told him he could do the same. School was a battlefield of microaggressions and low expectations. Teachers sometimes assumed he wasn't capable of advanced classes. Classmates mocked his accent or the way he spoke at home. But Marcus learned to navigate these obstacles with patience and strategy. He understood that intelligence alone wouldn't be enough. He would need resilience, confidence, and the ability to stand his ground in every room he entered. Even as a child, Marcus dreamed bigger than his surroundings. He imagined himself in courtrooms, standing before judges and juries, defending those who had no voice. He envisioned a future where he could change the rules of the game, where justice wasn't a privilege for the few, but a right for everyone. This dream became his compass, guiding him through late nights at the library, endless hours of homework, and the pressures of being the smart kid everyone expected to fail. By the time Marcus reached high school, the fire that had been quietly burning since childhood had grown into a relentless drive. Every act of injustice he witnessed, every unfair stop, every denied opportunity, every dismissive glance, only reinforced his determination. He wasn't just chasing a career, he was chasing a mission, to bend the arc of justice toward fairness, to give a voice to those society often ignored, and to ensure that no one, not even a child in his neighborhood, would feel powerless in the face of prejudice. The rise. Marcus Carter's rise was not handed to him. It was earned through relentless dedication, countless sacrifices, and an unshakable belief in justice. College had tested him in ways his childhood never could. Scholarships were limited, professors sometimes doubted his potential, and classmates assumed he was merely lucky to be there. But Marcus knew better. Every lecture, every paper, Every late-night study session was a step toward a dream he refused to abandon. Law school was an entirely new battlefield. The classrooms were filled with students from wealthier, more privileged backgrounds, many of whom had never encountered the systemic obstacles Marcus had faced. Yet, he quickly distinguished himself. His arguments were precise, his research meticulous, and his ability to weave empathy into legal reasoning set him apart. Professors began to take notice, not just of his intellect, but of the unwavering integrity that guided his work. It wasn't just academics that defined him. Marcus sought real-world experience, volunteering for civil rights organizations, taking pro bono cases, and defending families who had nowhere else to turn. He became known for fighting the cases others deemed impossible. Tenants facing illegal evictions, workers denied fair wages, and communities impacted by discriminatory policing. Each small victory built his reputation as a lawyer who didn't just understand the law, he embodied it. Despite the hurdles, recognition came. Marcus published articles in respected legal journals, speaking out against systemic injustice and offering pragmatic solutions to long-standing problems. He earned awards for his advocacy, invitations to speak at conferences, and eventually positions on committees shaping policy and reform. Every accolade, however, was measured against one standard. Did his work make a tangible difference in people's lives? Outside the courtroom, Marcus became a quiet pillar in his community. Neighbors respected him not only for his professional achievements, but for the humility with which he carried them. He mentored young students, volunteered at local schools, and remained approachable, never letting success distance him from the people he fought to serve. Through these years, Marcus built more than a career. He built a legacy of trust and integrity. People didn't just see a lawyer, they saw a protector of justice, a voice for those silenced, and a man whose work could ripple through the legal system and beyond. And yet, even with all this respect and accomplishment, Marcus remained cautious. He understood the fragility of perception and the biases lurking beneath the surface. No amount of success could fully shield him from a world that still judged him first by his skin and only later by his deeds. It was a reality he would face head-on in a moment that would test everything he had built, an encounter that would turn his life upside down, right at the doorstep of the home he fought so hard to create. Personal life. Marcus Carter's life outside the courtroom was as carefully cultivated as his legal career. At the center of it all was his family, his anchor and his constant reminder of why he fought so tirelessly for justice. His wife, Angela, was a teacher with a quiet strength and a heart full of patience. Together, they had built a life rooted in mutual respect, love, and shared ambition. Their two children, Jasmine and David, were the pride of their lives, bright, curious, and full of promise. Marcus saw in them the future he had once imagined for himself, a world of opportunity, free from the barriers that had defined his own youth. One of Marcus's proudest achievements wasn't a court victory or a published article. It was the home he and Angela had purchased after years of relentless saving. Nestled in a quiet, predominantly white neighborhood, it was the house they had dreamed about. A modest but elegant brick structure with a front porch where the children could play, a kitchen filled with warmth and laughter, and a backyard large enough for family gatherings. Every detail reflected their hard work and perseverance, a tangible proof that their sacrifices had not been in vain. But the neighborhood itself reminded Marcus that even in success, the shadows of prejudice lingered. Subtle glances, offhand comments, and whispered doubts reminded him that acceptance wasn't automatic, even in a community that outwardly appeared friendly. Yet Marcus and Angela were determined to claim their place, to raise their children in an environment that would challenge biases, while still offering a sense of safety and stability. They became involved in local events, met neighbors at school functions, and worked quietly to build relationships that were rooted in respect rather than assumption. Family dinners were sacred. Marcus would often share stories from the courtroom, carefully framed to teach lessons about fairness, responsibility, and courage. Jasmine and David learned early that life wasn't always just, but they also learned that resilience, knowledge, and integrity could be powerful tools to navigate the world. The home became a sanctuary, a place where Marcus could be a father and husband first, a lawyer second, and a man constantly aware of the larger battles only when necessary. Yet beneath the laughter and the carefully arranged routines, Marcus carried a quiet vigilance. He knew that prejudice could manifest in the most unexpected ways, often in moments that seemed ordinary. Every trip to the store, every interaction with authorities, was a reminder that his family's safety and dignity could not be taken for granted. The house was a dream realized, yes, but it was also a stage where the tensions of society could suddenly intrude, turning triumph into trial. It was in this delicate balance between joy and caution, success and vulnerability, that Marcus lived each day, unaware that one ordinary evening would soon transform his life. One night, the sanctuary he had fought so hard to create would be invaded in a way he could never have anticipated, setting the stage for a confrontation that would challenge everything he had built. The neighbors' glances. Even in a neighborhood that appeared calm and welcoming, Marcus Carter could feel the weight of subtle judgment pressing down on him. It wasn't overt hostility, not at first, but the quiet, almost imperceptible signals were everywhere. A nod that didn't quite reach the eyes, a hurried wave that seemed more obligation than warmth, a glance that lingered a second too long before quickly darting away. These small moments accumulated, forming an invisible wall around his family, one that no amount of professional success could tear down. Walking Jasmine and David to the bus stop, Marcus sometimes caught neighbors whispering behind curtains, their faces obscured but their curiosity, or suspicion, barely hidden. Conversations in the driveway would pause as he approached, and casual greetings were often met with a polite smile that didn't touch their eyes. Angela tried to brush it off, attributing it to the natural caution of people in a predominantly white neighborhood, but Marcus knew better. He had spent his life reading between the lines, deciphering the world's unspoken biases, and this was no exception. At community events, Marcus noticed the same patterns. He would arrive at a block party or a school meeting, and though he was always courteous and engaging, some neighbors subtly clustered elsewhere, their conversations halting when he entered. Invitations to casual gatherings were rare, often extended at the last minute or through indirect channels. The message, while never spoken aloud, was unmistakable. You are different, and we are unsure of how to place you in our world. Even the children felt it. Jasmine, perceptive and sensitive, would sometimes ask why her classmates' parents didn't speak to them as freely as they did to others. David would notice the hesitation when Marcus picked him up from soccer practice, the way some parents would avert their gaze or smile stiffly before looking away. Marcus felt a pang of frustration each time, knowing his children were inheriting a subtle lesson about the world, a lesson he wished he could soften, but could not. These microaggressions, small as they seemed, were a constant reminder that success could not shield them from bias. Marcus carried the burden quietly, never letting it cloud his public demeanor, but inside, he understood the stakes. The neighborhood he had chosen for its safety and opportunity was also a place of constant vigilance. Every interaction, every glance, had to be navigated carefully, a silent negotiation for dignity that his children might not fully understand yet. And so life continued with a fragile equilibrium. Laughter filled the house, family dinners were warm, and Marcus's work remained a beacon of hope. Yet, outside the front door, the world still measured him before it knew him. The eyes of the neighborhood watched constantly, and Marcus knew that one misstep, or one misperception, could turn curiosity into suspicion, and suspicion into confrontation. First encounters with the police. Marcus Carter had always understood the fragile line between respect and suspicion, but nothing could fully prepare him for the subtle hostility that awaited him just outside his own home. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. On evenings when he drove Jasmine and David to soccer practice or returned from a late court session, he would notice patrol cars following a little too closely, taillights flickering in the rearview mirror, engines idling just a block away. The first stop was routine, the officer's words carefully measured. "Evening, sir. Mind if we ask where you're headed?" Marcus answered politely, handing over his license and registration with calm composure. Yet the questions lingered longer than necessary. The officer's eyes scanned the car, landing on Marcus with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, as if trying to decide whether he belonged in the neighborhood he had worked so hard to claim. Weeks later, it happened again. This time Marcus was leaving a grocery store when two officers pulled him over. "Just a precaution," one said, their tone friendly on the surface, but sharp beneath it. They asked routine questions, rifled through the glove compartment and even checked the trunk. Marcus stayed calm, explaining his errands and showing his identification. Still, the underlying suspicion was palpable. Other drivers passing by offered sympathetic glances, silently acknowledging that they too had witnessed the subtle yet pointed injustice. These encounters were small, almost mundane, but they left an imprint. Marcus couldn't ignore the unspoken truth. In the eyes of the police, he was never simply a law-abiding citizen. His race marked him, subtly shaping the narrative before a word was even spoken. Each stop, each inspection, felt like a reminder that no amount of professional achievement or personal integrity could erase the assumptions attached to him. Even in his own driveway, the sense of being watched lingered. Officers would sometimes drive slowly past his home, glancing inside as if to confirm that everything was in order. Neighbors rarely intervened or questioned their behavior, and Marcus quickly learned that politeness could not always shield one from suspicion. He began to notice patterns, the same officers appearing repeatedly, the same questions asked with thinly veiled doubt. Despite these challenges, Marcus remained composed. He refused to react with anger, knowing that any display of frustration could be misinterpreted or worse, used against him. Instead, he documented every encounter meticulously, creating a record of each stop, each question, each moment of unnecessary scrutiny. He understood that knowledge was power, and in a world where bias often dictated action, being prepared could mean the difference between dignity and humiliation. Yet the unease lingered. Every drive, every walk down the street, carried a subtle tension. The neighborhood that had once promised safety now felt like a stage where his family's vulnerability was constantly tested. And Marcus knew deep down that this was only the beginning, a prelude to an encounter that would challenge not just his patience, but the very principles of justice he had spent his life defending. Emotional toll. What began as subtle glances and routine stops soon evolved into a constant gnawing pressure on Marcus Carter and his family. The cumulative weight of suspicion, the repeated invasions of dignity, and the sense that even his own neighborhood viewed him as an outsider began to chip away at the household's sense of security. Marcus had always carried the responsibility of shielding his family from the harsh realities of bias, but the burden was growing heavier with each passing day. Jasmine, perceptive beyond her years, started asking questions that were impossible to ignore. "Daddy, why do those cars always follow us?" she asked one evening after soccer practice, her voice a mixture of fear and confusion. David noticed it too, clutching his mother's hand tightly when officers passed by their driveway, his small face twisted in worry. Marcus tried to answer calmly, emphasizing that they were safe and that nothing they had done warranted suspicion. But the truth was harder to mask. The world could judge you before it knew you, and sometimes justice didn't come quickly or fairly. Angela, ever supportive, did her best to maintain normalcy. She encouraged family dinners filled with laughter, planned weekend outings, and insisted on keeping the children focused on school and friends. Yet even she felt the invisible tension pressing down on them. Marcus could see the worry in her eyes, the quiet question, how long before one of these encounters escalated into something dangerous? Every knock at the door, every flashlight outside the window, reminded them that their sanctuary was fragile. Marcus himself felt the strain. The meticulous records of police stops, the mental notes of each encounter, the constant vigilance, it all began to wear on him. Sleep came fitfully, his mind replaying each interaction, imagining what might have happened if he had reacted differently. His professional composure could not fully shield him from the frustration and anger simmering beneath the surface. But in front of his family, he remained the calm protector, the voice of reason and resilience, refusing to let fear dictate their lives. The emotional toll extended beyond fear. It seeped into small, everyday moments. Jasmine hesitated to invite friends over, worried about how neighbors might judge. David sometimes asked why certain kids' parents looked at them strangely. Even routine walks to the park were shadowed by Marcus's careful calculations, scanning for any signs of bias, any hint that an ordinary day could become a confrontation. And yet, amid the stress, a quiet bond strengthened within the family. They leaned on each other, shared their anxieties, and developed resilience together. Marcus's lessons on justice, integrity, and courage became living examples, guiding his children through an environment that was not always welcoming. But beneath the surface, everyone knew that the most internal dilemma, Marcus Carter, had reached a crossroads in his mind long before the next confrontation with the police. He had spent decades building a reputation as a formidable civil rights attorney, one whose expertise could sway a courtroom and whose words carried weight in policy discussion. And yet, every time he faced these routine stops, every glance of suspicion or whispered judgment, he wrestled with a choice. Should he reveal who he was to protect himself, or maintain the dignity of being treated like any other citizen. It wasn't a decision made lightly. Using his credentials as a shield could have ended countless uncomfortable encounters. One word lawyer, one glance at a badge or a nameplate could have stopped officers in their tracks, sparing him from frisking, questioning, or the lingering suspicion that always followed. It would have been the easy way, the path that preserved comfort and avoided confrontation, but Marcus knew that taking that route would come at a cost he wasn't willing to pay. He had built his career on principle, on the idea that justice should apply equally to all, regardless of status, wealth, or influence. To leverage his position for personal protection would be a betrayal of that ethos. It would send the message to his children and the community he served that power rather than fairness, dictated who deserved respect. Every time he handed over his identification, every time he answered questions politely and complied with unnecessary searches, Marcus reminded himself why he made this choice. He wanted his family and the wider community to see that courage wasn't just about victories in the courtroom. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice, even when no one would know who you were, even when no one would advocate for you. The internal struggle was exhausting. Marcus often lay awake at night replaying encounters, wondering if his decision had put him at greater risk than necessary. Could he justify staying silent when his safety, or that of his children, hung in the balance? And yet, every moral compromise he avoided, every principle he held firm, strengthened his character and, ultimately, the lesson he hoped to impart to Jasmine and David, that integrity and justice were worth far more than convenience or fear. This dilemma also shaped his interactions with Angela. He shared with her his fears, his reasoning, and the quiet tension that came with refusing to use his position as leverage. She supported him, recognizing that his steadfastness, though costly in the moment, was part of what made him the man she respected and loved. Together, they navigated the fragile balance between prudence and principle, a balance that would soon be tested in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. Marcus's choice was clear. He would face the world as he had always wanted to be seen, not as a powerful lawyer or a man of influence, but as a human being demanding the dignity and respect owed to every citizen. This resolve, however, would place him directly in the path of an encounter that would test not only his patience but the very limits of the justice he had spent his life defending. Calm before the storm. It was a quiet evening, the kind of night that suggested the world had momentarily pressed pause. Marcus Carter had just finished a grueling day in court, wrapping up a case that had consumed him for weeks. His mind was still sharp with legal arguments, evidence, and witness testimonies, but he was looking forward to the one thing that could soothe the tension, the warm embrace of his family and the sanctuary of home. The streets were unusually empty as Marcus drove through the familiar neighborhood, the soft hum of tires on asphalt blending with the distant murmur of city life. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Everything seemed normal, yet Marcus couldn't shake the lingering awareness that peace in this area was often fleeting. He had grown accustomed to the subtle signs, the watchful eyes, the passing patrol cars, the small unspoken tensions, but tonight he allowed himself a rare moment of calm. Angela had dinner waiting, the aroma of roasted chicken and fresh vegetables greeting him even before he stepped inside the house. Jasmine and David were sprawled on the living room floor, textbooks and drawing supplies scattered around them, their laughter light and carefree. For a few precious minutes, the weight of the world seemed to lift. Marcus smiled, feeling the relief that comes when work is set aside and family fills the mind with joy rather than worry. As he unpacked his briefcase and hung up his coat, Marcus allowed himself to reflect. Days like this were rare. Rare for him, rare for anyone who understood the constant balancing act between professional responsibilities and the unseen pressures of living as a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood. He knew that vigilance was always necessary, but for this moment he chose to trust that the routine of evening, the comfort of home, would protect them. He lingered in the hallway, glancing out the window at the quiet street, noticing the familiar patrol car parked a few houses down. His pulse quickened slightly, not out of alarm but out of recognition that the neighborhood's serenity could be deceptive. Marcus had learned to read the signs, to anticipate tension where others saw none. Yet tonight he chose optimism. The streets were silent, the air calm, and for a fleeting moment he allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just for tonight, nothing would disrupt the fragile peace. Dinner was served, and the family gathered around the table, sharing stories, jokes, and smiles. The children's laughter filled the house, mingling with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards. Marcus savored these small joys, fully aware that they were fleeting. Deep down he felt the tension coiled just beyond the edge of perception, a storm gathering that would test every principle, every lesson, and every ounce of courage he had cultivated over a lifetime. This quiet evening, filled with warmth and familiarity, was the final reprieve before an encounter that would challenge Marcus Carter in ways no courtroom ever had. It was the calm before the storm, a momentary pause before the forces of prejudice, authority, and injustice collided head-on with the man who had spent his life defending the law. The neighbor's call. It was late in the evening when the first sign of trouble came, not from the streetlights or the patrol cars, but from a neighbor's hurried phone call. Marcus Carter had been finishing paperwork at the dining table, his children laughing over a board game, Angela sipping tea beside him. The sudden shrill ring of the phone broke the calm, a sound that seemed unusually sharp in the quiet of their home. "Hello," Angela answered, her voice cautious. The neighbor on the line spoke quickly, almost breathlessly. There's a man trying to break into your house. I think he's suspicious." Her tone was frantic, tinged with fear and urgency. The words felt like an alarm bell in Marcus's chest. He stood immediately, instinctively moving toward the door, his mind racing. Marcus recognized the panic in the neighbor's voice. He knew the likelihood of a true threat was low, the neighborhood was safe, and the kids had been inside playing. But he also knew that perception often outpaced reality, especially when assumptions about race came into play. The suspicious man they were reporting wasn't an intruder at all. It was him. Angela's hand found his arm, steadying him even as her own worry deepened. "Marcus, maybe we should call the police first just to clarify," she suggested, trying to bridge caution with reason. Marcus nodded, already reaching for his phone. He wanted to resolve this calmly, logically, and quickly, but he couldn't shake the bitter irony. The very people tasked with protecting him would soon arrive, fueled by an unfounded fear that had been triggered simply by his presence in his own home. As he dialed 911, he glanced at Jasmine and David, their eyes wide and alert. He crouched slightly, offering quiet reassurance. "Everything's going to be fine," he whispered, though he knew that the word fine was fragile, hanging by a thread in a world that didn't always recognize justice. The operator's voice was steady, professional, taking down the report, promising officers would be dispatched immediately. Minutes felt like hours as Marcus positioned himself near the front door, his family behind him, aware of every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the flickering porch light. The irony was suffocating. In moments, law enforcement would arrive, not to aid him in a real emergency, but to confront a black man in his own home, an accomplished lawyer, a father, a husband, whose only crime was existing within the expectations and fears of others. He took a deep breath, centering himself. His years of preparation, his understanding of law and civility, all pointed toward a single guiding principle: stay calm, stay respectful, and do not escalate. Marcus knew that any sudden move could be misinterpreted, that the world often read aggression where there was none. He mentally rehearsed the words he would use, the demeanor he would maintain, preparing for the inevitable encounter that would test not only his patience, but the very core of his principles. Outside, the night remained quiet, deceptively so, while inside tension coiled tight around the family. The call had set in motion a chain of events that Marcus had anticipated in theory, but never imagined would unfold in the place that should have been their sanctuary. This was no longer just a matter of perception. It was the opening act of a confrontation that would challenge everything Marcus Carter stood for. Arrival of the police. The distant wail of sirens cut through the night, a sudden jolt that shattered the fragile calm in the Carter household. Marcus Carter stood near the front door, his family behind him, each heartbeat syncing with the approaching footsteps and engines. Within moments, 2 police vehicles rolled onto the street, lights flashing, officers stepping out with the kind of brisk energy that signaled authority and suspicion. The first officer, a tall man with a stern expression, approached Marcus immediately. "Sir, we received a call about a suspicious individual trying to enter this residence," he said, his tone firm but not overtly hostile. Marcus met his gaze steadily, keeping his hands visible. "That's me," he replied calmly. "I live here." The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning Marcus from head to toe, lingering in a way that made him feel smaller, despite the years of courtroom battles and legal triumphs. "ID, please," the officer demanded. Marcus complied without hesitation, producing his driver's license and showing his badge of residency. "Sir, step aside. We need to check the premises," the second officer added, his voice clipped, his movements impatient. Marcus felt the tension in the air coil tighter. His family was watching, tense, unsure of what would unfold next. Jasmine clutched her mother's hand. David pressed close to Marcus, both children absorbing the gravity of the moment. Despite presenting identification and calmly explaining the situation, the officers remained suspicious. Every word Marcus spoke seemed measured against a baseline of doubt. Every gesture he made, no matter how benign, was analyzed as if it could conceal intent. The very law he had spent his life advocating for, the law that demanded fairness, justice, and respect, seemed to pause at the threshold of his own home. The approach became more assertive. "Hands where we can see them," one officer commanded, positioning himself slightly to the side, ready for action. Marcus obeyed without resistance, aware that any sign of defensiveness could escalate the situation. The officers circled, scrutinized, and questioned, their voices a mixture of professional procedure and unspoken suspicion. Inside the house, Angela kept the children close, her own pulse quickening. She whispered reassurances to Jasmine and David, but her words rang hollow against the tension radiating from the front door. Marcus remained composed, explaining patiently that they lived there, that the call was a misunderstanding. Yet the officer's demeanor suggested that logic alone might not suffice. Marcus's mind raced, not in panic, but in calculation. He knew the power of words, the influence of calm authority, and the importance of compliance in moments where bias could distort reality. He reinforced internally, "Stay calm, remain respectful, and do not let anger or frustration surface." The room felt smaller, the night colder, as the officers continued their aggressive sweep, unaware of the professional and personal stature of the man they were confronting. Outside, the flashing lights reflected off the windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the living room. Marcus's sanctuary had transformed into a stage of suspicion and tension, the very home he had fought to create, now a battlefield where perception overruled reality. Every second stretched, the anticipation of what would happen next, pressing heavily upon the family, building toward a confrontation that would test patience, courage, and the principles Marcus held most dear. Escalating tension. The situation had escalated far beyond Marcus Carter's worst anticipations. The officers had moved from suspicious to confrontational, their voices sharp and movements rigid. Every instruction carried the weight of authority. But underneath, Marcus could sense the suspicion, a presumption that he was somehow out of place in his own home. His calm demeanor was tested as the seconds stretched, the silence between commands heavier than words. Angela, unable to watch passively, stepped forward. "Please, he's my husband," she said, her voice firm but edged with fear. "He lives here. You've made a mistake." Her hands were raised, palms open, the universal gesture of peace. For a moment it seemed as though reason might prevail, but the officer in command, tall and impatient, shifted his stance, leaning slightly toward her. "Ma'am, step back or you'll be treated as interfering," he said sharply. The words struck Angela like a physical blow. Her heart pounded, and for a fleeting second, fear overtook reason. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a subtle nod of reassurance, silently instructing her to stay calm despite the tension. Behind her, Jasmine and David were visibly distressed. The children clung to each other, their small faces streaked with tears. They didn't fully understand the intricacies of law or bias, but they understood fear. They understood the sense of danger in their home, the place that had always been their safe haven. Marcus crouched slightly, whispering gentle reassurances. It's okay, stay calm, stay together. We'll be fine," he murmured, his words measured, deliberate, meant to anchor them in the storm of authority pressing at their doorstep. The officer's scrutiny intensified. Hands hovered near belts, eyes darted to doors and windows, and questions came rapidly, almost cutting through the air. Marcus produced his identification again, repeating his explanations patiently, but the officer's suspicion remained, like a cloud refusing to dissipate. Every gesture, every breath seemed to be misinterpreted, and Marcus felt the full weight of systemic bias pressing into the room. The tension was suffocating. Angela tried to interject again, this time explaining the neighborhood, the routine, even the recent call that had triggered the police response. Her voice trembled slightly, and for a brief instant, Marcus feared she might be further endangered by her courage. The children's sobs became audible, small yet piercing, echoing off the walls, a painful reminder of innocence caught in the crossfire. Marcus's mind raced. He weighed every possible action, every word carefully, understanding that even a small misstep could escalate into catastrophe. He drew on every ounce of composure, every principle he had taught his children, and every lesson learned in decades of navigating a world that often judged before it understood. This was the point of maximum pressure, the apex of tension before the reveal, the moment when authority, fear, and misperception collided, threatening to shatter the fragile calm Marcus had worked so hard to maintain. The scene was set for a confrontation that would test courage, patience, and integrity in ways that no courtroom could ever replicate. The arrest. The moment had arrived, the culmination of mounting tension that had been building for weeks, months, even years. Marcus Carter stood with his hands raised, palms outward, trying to convey compliance and calm, but it was clear to him that reason held little sway tonight. The officer in command, eyes hardened by suspicion, made a swift motion. "Hands behind your back," he barked. Before Marcus could respond further, cold metal clamped around his wrists. The click of the handcuffs echoed ominously in the quiet house, a sound that seemed disproportionate to the simple act of living in one's own home. Angela gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she tried to stifle a scream. Jasmine and David froze, tears already streaming down their faces, unable to process the sight of their father being restrained by those who were supposed to protect. Marcus felt a familiar mixture of frustration and disbelief, emotions he had long learned to control in the courtroom, but could do little to restrain now. He remained calm, speaking softly. "Please, officers, this is unnecessary. I live here. You have my identification, everything you need to verify who I am." His words were measured, deliberate, each one an attempt to prevent the situation from spiraling further. The officers barely acknowledged his explanation. One of them stepped in front of Angela and the children, effectively creating a barrier between Marcus and his family. "Step back," the officer warned. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with fear and disbelief. The children clutched each other, their sobs punctuating the silence between orders and movements. As Marcus was guided toward the squad car, he glanced at his family, his eyes silently conveying reassurance. "Stay calm. I'll be okay," he mouthed, though he knew the sight would haunt Angela and the children for years. Every step he took toward the vehicle was measured, a silent protest against the injustice being enacted in his own driveway. The flash of police lights cast sharp shadows across the living room as the officers worked with efficiency that lacked empathy. Marcus could feel the surreal absurdity of it all. The man being arrested, handcuffed, and led away in front of his family was one of the most respected lawyers in the state, someone who had spent his life defending the law. Yet here he was, reduced to a target of suspicion, a victim of systemic bias, playing out in its rawest, most personal form. Angela clutched the children tightly, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. The officers, focused solely on procedure, didn't notice the subtle devastation in their wake. Marcus's dignity, patience, and composure were his only armor as the squad car doors closed, sealing him inside. The engine started, the vehicle's red and blue lights cutting through the night, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stretch, every second an eternity for the family left behind. And as the car pulled away, Marcus Carter's eyes remained fixed on his home, his children, his wife, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew this moment would not define him. It was merely another test of the principles, courage, and integrity that had guided him his entire life. Yet the injustice of being treated this way in his own driveway, the surreal, painful truth of the world he lived in, was undeniable. Humiliation at the police station. The fluorescent lights of the precinct were harsh, casting a sterile glare across the cold grey walls. Marcus Carter was ushered into the processing area, handcuffed and guided with the same impersonal precision afforded to common offenders. Each step echoed unnervingly in the cavernous room, a reminder that no one here recognized who he truly was. He tried to speak, to explain, his voice steady despite the tension. "I live in that house." "There's been a mistake," he began, presenting his identification and calmly recounting the events leading to the call. But the officers behind the counter barely looked up. They were methodical, mechanical, treating every word as background noise, every gesture as routine behavior, and every explanation as suspect. Marcus felt the sting of invisibility, not because he lacked status or accomplishment, but because the uniformed officers had chosen to see him only through the lens of suspicion. His credentials, his professional stature, his lifetime advocating for justice, all irrelevant. The system treated him as any other person accused of wrongdoing, ignoring the context, ignoring the truth. The humiliation deepened with each interaction. He was photographed, fingerprinted, and questioned repeatedly, the officer's eyes scanning his responses as if expecting a confession. Marcus answered politely, fully aware that any hint of frustration could be misinterpreted as resistance. The irony was bitter. Here he was, a respected lawyer, someone who had argued cases of immense consequence, being processed like a criminal without cause. Even small acts became charged with embarrassment. He was made to wait while officers discussed unrelated cases, shuffling from room to room with a calm courtesy he forced upon himself, masking the indignation bubbling beneath the surface. Each glance from other detainees and personnel was a reminder that the world often judged him before it understood him. Angela's words from home replayed in his mind. Stay calm, stay composed. He held onto them like a lifeline, knowing that patience, not confrontation, was the only weapon he had in this moment. His thoughts shifted briefly to Jasmine and David, imagining their frightened eyes watching from the doorway of their home, witnessing their father's dignity tested in the crucible of prejudice. Even when Marcus attempted to assert his identity again, reminding officers that he was an attorney, that he lived at the residence in question, the words fell on deaf ears. The bureaucracy of assumption, the cold machinery of suspicion, overrode reason and decency. The experience was both surreal and painfully real. The very principles he had devoted his life to defending were ignored, replaced by a system that saw only color, circumstance, and stereotype. By the time he was finally seated, exhausted, and stripped of the final layer of composure, Marcus Carter understood the depth of the world's inequities. The humiliation was complete, not in physical restraint, but in the dismissal of truth, the denial of recognition, and the cold assertion of authority over justice. And yet, deep inside, he knew that the real reckoning, the moment that would expose the absurdity and injustice of this ordeal, was still to come. Hours of waiting time stretched interminably within the walls of the precinct. Marcus Carter sat on the hard bench, handcuffed and weary, feeling the weight of hours pressed down like a physical force. Each passing minute was a reminder that the law he had devoted his life to, the justice he had fought tirelessly for, seemed powerless in the face of prejudice and assumption. The room around him was filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of paperwork, but no one seemed to notice his presence beyond the routine procedural motions. Officers came and went, glancing briefly in his direction, eyes heavy with indifference. Marcus attempted to speak, to clarify, to assert once again that he was in no way a threat, that he was a resident, a father, a lawyer, but his words were met with polite disinterest or outright dismissal. Minutes became hours. Marcus leaned back against the cold wall, trying to find a position of comfort on the unforgiving bench. He observed the clock ticking slowly, each second a hammer of frustration and disbelief. His thoughts drifted back to Angela, Jasmine, and David at home, imagining their worry and fear, wondering if they understood that he was alive, that he was still fighting to maintain composure in an environment that refused to recognize him. Every interaction felt like a battle waged against invisibility. When he attempted to ask a question, an officer would redirect him, ignoring the context or importance of his inquiry. Requests to contact his attorney were met with bureaucratic delays, forms shuffled without explanation, voices raised in impatience at his persistence. Marcus understood the procedures, knew the rules, yet found them weaponized against him in subtle, disheartening ways. The silence of indifference was almost worse than overt hostility. Sitting there, restrained and disregarded, Marcus felt the slow erosion of dignity that comes from being unseen, unheard, and unacknowledged. It was a strange, surreal kind of isolation, surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. The very principles of justice he had dedicated his career to, fairness, impartiality, and due process, were suspended in the air, intangible and ignored. Marcus's thoughts oscillated between frustration and strategy. He reminded himself that patience was not surrender. Each moment of restraint was an exercise in control, a demonstration of the composure he hoped to model for his children. Despite the humiliation and the sheer absurdity of the situation, he held on to the belief that truth, eventually, had to emerge. Hours passed, and the waiting became a test of endurance. Marcus Carter, lawyer, advocate, father, and husband, remained seated in the precinct, handcuffed yet unbroken, his mind quietly calculating the path forward. He understood that the ordeal was far from over, that justice had yet to be fully realized, and that the moment of revelation, the moment when the absurdity of this treatment would finally be exposed, was still approaching. The discovery hours had passed, each one dragging with the weight of anticipation and frustration. Marcus Carter remained seated on the hard bench, handcuffed yet composed, as the officers shuffled paperwork and typed into their computers. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by the clatter of keyboards and the occasional murmur between officers. It was routine work for them, or so they thought, but for Marcus, every tick of the clock amplified the absurdity of his situation. One officer, tasked with checking Marcus's background, began typing his information into the state database. Names, addresses, and affiliations scrolled across the screen. Marcus watched calmly, knowing the procedure was standard, yet acutely aware that his identity carried more weight than they could imagine. He had lived this life with diligence, advocating for justice, drafting laws, shaping the very statutes that governed law enforcement across the state. As the officer scrolled through the records, his brow furrowed. "Wait, this can't be right," he muttered under his breath, eyes narrowing at the screen. Marcus kept his expression neutral, letting the officer uncover the truth without interference. Behind him, the atmosphere in the precinct seemed unchanged, until a second officer leaned over, curious. "What is it?" the second asked, peering at the monitor. The first officer's voice trembled slightly, a mixture of surprise and disbelief. This guy, he's involved in drafting the state's use of force laws. He literally wrote the guidelines that we enforce. Look at this." Marcus's heart remained steady, but inside a quiet satisfaction stirred. The irony was almost poetic. The men who had treated him as a criminal, who had ignored his explanations and dismissed his identity, were now confronted with a truth that forced them to pause. Their perception, shaped by bias and assumption, collided with reality. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Marcus had been treated as an intruder, a threat, a man to be restrained. And yet here he was, a legal authority whose work guided the very actions they had taken against him. The dissonance was palpable. Angela and the children, though outside the room, could sense a shift in energy. The quiet murmurs, the hurried typing, the subtle tension in the officers' voices, all hinted that the tide might finally turn. Marcus, still calm, kept his composure. He knew that recognition alone would not resolve the injustice, but it marked the first crack in the wall of misconception that had imprisoned him, figuratively and literally. In that moment, the absurdity of the situation reached its peak. The man who had spent a lifetime upholding and shaping the law had been handcuffed, ignored, and humiliated. And yet now the officers faced an undeniable reality. Marcus Carter was not just a resident or a father, he was a pivotal figure in the legal framework they swore to uphold. This revelation set the stage for the reckoning to come. The tension, once oppressive, began to shift, hinting at the moment when authority would be confronted with truth, and when Marcus's dignity, patience, and unwavering composure would finally be recognized. Shock at the police station. A heavy silence settled over the precinct, one that felt heavier than any physical weight Marcus Carter had ever encountered. The officers, once brisk and commanding, now froze, their eyes widening as the reality of the situation slowly sank in. Marcus remained seated, handcuffed, his posture calm, almost statuesque, as if the irony of the moment were a silent shield. "What, chat, this can't be right," one officer muttered, voice barely above a whisper, glancing at his partner for confirmation. The other leaned closer to the computer screen, scrolling through the records again, each line of Marcus's credentials and legal contributions forcing a reluctant acknowledgement. He literally helped draft the state's use of force laws. He's a key legal authority, the second officer stammered, disbelief thick in his tone. Marcus felt a subtle shift in the energy around him. The very men who had treated him with suspicion, had ignored his explanations, had handcuffed him in his own home, were now confronted with the undeniable truth. The reality of their mistake hung in the air, unspoken but powerful. It was as if time had slowed, each second stretching to emphasize the absurdity and gravity of the situation. Angela and the children, watching from the other side of the precinct lobby, sensed the sudden change. The officer's body language had shifted from aggressive authority to awkward hesitation. Marcus, ever composed, observed silently, noting the flicker of recognition and shock crossing their faces. He had endured the humiliation, maintained his dignity, and now the scales of perception were finally tilting in his favor. The commanding officer, who had first ordered Marcus to be restrained, swallowed hard, his voice catching as he muttered something under his breath. I didn't realize." His words trailed off, replaced by a stunned silence. Around him, other personnel exchanged uneasy glances, the reality settling in that they had detained a man whose authority they had not only failed to recognize, but had actively undermined. Marcus remained calm, his eyes steady, his expression composed. He did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. The moment itself carried all the weight it needed. The injustice he had suffered, the repeated stops, the humiliation, the assumptions made about his presence, was now confronted by the undeniable truth of his identity. In that silence, the officers were forced to reconcile their actions with the reality before them. The tension that had suffocated the room moments ago began to shift, a quiet acknowledgement of error settling over the precinct. Marcus Carter had been treated as a criminal, yet here he sat, unbroken and dignified, a man whose lifetime of legal expertise and personal integrity now demanded recognition. The shock was complete, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, heavy, and undeniable. Marcus Carter's eyes met those of the officers briefly, calm and unwavering, as if to silently convey, the truth always surfaces, and justice, in one form or another, cannot be denied. Immediate reaction. The moment of recognition hit the precinct like a shockwave. Marcus Carter, calm and composed, remained seated, observing the officers scramble around him. What had been rigid protocol and indifference transformed instantly into chaos, disbelief, and hurried attempts to regain control. The very men who had treated him as a threat now moved with a new kind of urgency, an urgency born not of authority, but of embarrassment and fear. "Sir, we're very sorry," one officer stammered, the words awkward, almost unrecognizable as sincere. He adjusted his uniform nervously, avoided Marcus's steady gaze, and muttered something about a procedural misunderstanding. The apology felt forced, lacking the weight it should have carried, as though saying it out loud might erase the enormity of their mistake. Another officer was already typing rapidly at a nearby computer, calling supervisors, attempting to document the error before word could spread. Phones buzzed, radios crackled, and the precinct seemed to hum with hurried attempts to control the narrative. Marcus's identification and credentials were now being cross-checked repeatedly, as though verifying for a second, third, and fourth time could undo the hours of error, the humiliation inflicted in his own home. Angela, standing nearby with Jasmine and David clinging to her, felt a mix of relief and lingering outrage. The officer's apologies did little to erase the trauma, the fear, and the shame of the night's events. Marcus finally rose, his posture calm, his voice measured. "I understand mistakes happen," he said, each word deliberate, carrying authority and quiet power. But this was not just a mistake. It was a reflection of assumptions and bias that cannot be ignored. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that words alone could not rectify what had occurred. The procedural mistake, the misjudgment, the lack of recognition, they were all glaringly obvious now, amplified by the fact that Marcus Carter was no ordinary citizen. The tension in the room remained palpable, a silent acknowledgement that the incident would not fade quietly, no matter how much they wanted it to. Attempts to minimize the situation became more frantic. One officer tried to dismiss the ordeal as a routine misunderstanding, while another whispered to a superior about keeping the incident internal. Yet the very presence of Marcus, composed and unwavering, made it impossible to sweep away. The man they had handcuffed and humiliated commanded respect simply by being himself, calm, dignified, and fully aware of the absurdity of what had transpired. As Marcus collected his personal items and prepared to leave, the officers fell silent, their attempts at control exhausted. The weight of the revelation hung heavily over the precinct. The man they had treated as a criminal, the subject of hours of unnecessary restraint and suspicion, was someone who shaped the very laws they enforced. And now, as he stepped toward the door, The realization of their error would linger, a lesson in humility and accountability that could not be undone. Controlled fury. Marcus Carter finally stood, handcuffs removed, his posture straight, eyes steady, exuding a quiet power that filled the room more than any raised voice could. The officers, still rattled by their own oversight, fumbled with words, offering repeated apologies that rang hollow against the weight of the injustice he had endured. But Marcus was not there to accept excuses. He was there to assert the dignity stripped from him in his own home. "I appreciate your acknowledgement," he began, his voice calm yet firm, "but what I experienced tonight goes far beyond a simple mistake. This was a failure rooted in assumptions, in bias, and in a lack of recognition for the humanity of the people you are sworn to protect." Each word was deliberate, cutting through the tension in the room like a scalpel, precise and unavoidable. Angela, Jasmine, and David, standing just beyond the threshold, watched with a mixture of awe and relief. Marcus's composure was a lesson in itself, that true power was not in the handcuffs or authority wielded against him, but in the unwavering assertion of one's rights and identity. The children clutched each other tightly, inspired by their father's strength, even as the echoes of fear from earlier hours lingered. The officers shifted uncomfortably, caught between protocol and the undeniable reality before them. Marcus continued, his calm fury creating a weight that pressed on every person in the room. "Do not mistake silence for compliance. I am not here to punish you, but I will not accept being treated as less than human. Your procedures and assumptions cannot strip away the dignity of those you interact with. You must do better, for the sake of justice, for the sake of your own integrity." There was a moment of profound stillness, the kind that precedes recognition of accountability. Marcus's words were not raised in anger, yet they carried the force of moral authority. The officers' attempts to minimize the incident, to rush past their error with empty apologies, faltered under the weight of his presence. For the first time they truly saw him, not as a target of suspicion, not as a detainee, but as a man whose life, work, and dignity demanded respect. He turned briefly to his family, offering a small, reassuring nod. "We are leaving now," he said softly but firmly, signaling the end of the ordeal. The message was clear. While he could maintain composure and civility, he would never allow disrespect, bias, or humiliation to define him. Marcus Carter's calm fury was not destructive. It was transformative, a quiet but powerful declaration that injustice may persist, but dignity and self-respect are inviolable. As he stepped toward the exit, every eye followed him, some in awe, others in uneasy acknowledgement. The room had changed. The air carried a weight of realization that Marcus Carter had not only survived an ordeal that could have broken him, but had emerged asserting the principle that true authority is earned through integrity, not fear or assumption. The repercussion. By the next morning, the story had already begun to ripple through the community. A local news outlet, tipped off by an anonymous source, ran the headline, "Prominent lawyer handcuffed in own home, police mistake sparks outrage." Social media erupted almost immediately, citizens expressing disbelief, anger, and solidarity. Marcus Carter's name, once known only in legal circles, became a symbol of both the absurdity and the urgency of confronting systemic bias. Angela and the children watched in a mix of amazement and lingering fear as their phones buzzed incessantly with notifications, messages, and calls. Friends, colleagues, and neighbors reached out, some expressing shock, others offering support, and many demanding accountability. The narrative had shifted. Marcus was no longer the target of suspicion. He had become the center of a conversation about justice, dignity, and the very human cost of assumptions. News crews descended, cameras rolling, microphones thrust toward the Carter home. Reporters quoted neighbors, community leaders, and legal experts, dissecting the incident, emphasizing its symbolic and practical significance. Headlines highlighted the irony. A man who had helped draft the very laws being enforced had been humiliated, detained, and disregarded, only to emerge as a figure demanding fairness and recognition. Community reaction was swift and emphatic. Local organizations, civil rights advocates, and legal associations issued statements condemning the treatment Marcus had endured. Online petitions circulated, calling for thorough review of police procedures and bias training. Conversations erupted in forums, social media threads, and neighborhood meetings, all centering on the disconnect between authority and accountability and the urgent need to address systemic prejudice. Even within the precinct, Murmurs of discomfort spread. Officers who had witnessed the public reaction realized that the incident could no longer be minimized or quietly forgotten. Supervisors scrambled to manage optics, issuing statements, clarifying procedural errors, and promising internal reviews. Yet the narrative had already escaped their control. The community's collective voice, amplified by digital media, ensured that accountability would be demanded publicly. Marcus remained composed throughout the whirlwind. He did not seek attention or public sympathy. He allowed the facts, his dignity, and the sheer injustice of the incident to speak for themselves. Each article, each post, each news segment underscored the broader truth he had always known. Systemic bias could humiliate, but it could not erase integrity, knowledge, or the pursuit of justice. By evening, the Carter household had become a quiet hub of reflection. Angela, Jasmine, and David gathered around Marcus, their admiration and relief mingling with lingering anxiety. The ordeal had transformed them all, not just as a family, but as witnesses to the resilience, courage, and unwavering principles that defined Marcus Carter. The story had leapt from a private moment of humiliation to a public reckoning, forcing the community, the media, and the authorities to confront a reality they could no longer ignore. Political impact. The incident at the Carter residence had rippled far beyond the precinct, capturing the attention of lawmakers and policymakers across the state. Within days, the story had reached the chambers of the state Senate, sparking debates on the very issues Marcus Carter had long addressed in his legal career: policing, bias, and accountability. Senators referenced the case as a stark example of the disconnect between law enforcement and the communities they serve, highlighting the urgent need for reform. Committee meetings convened to examine police procedures, with lawmakers poring over reports, body cam footage, and citizen testimonies. Marcus's ordeal became a focal point, a real-life demonstration of how assumptions and systemic bias could lead to humiliation, injustice, and public outrage. Advocates for reform used the case to push forward comprehensive legislation, addressing racial profiling, mandatory bias training, and stricter oversight on stop-and-frisk practices. The story dominated hearings. One senator, addressing colleagues, remarked, "If a man who helped draft the state's use of force laws can be handcuffed in his own home, imagine the countless others whose voices go unheard and whose dignity is disregarded every day." Murmurs of agreement echoed through the chamber as lawmakers grappled with the undeniable proof that the system was failing not only in perception but in practice. Public hearings invited testimony from community leaders, civil rights activists, and legal experts. Marcus Carter was asked to speak not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a professional articulating systemic failings with clarity and authority. He emphasized the importance of accountability, transparency, and the enforcement of existing laws alongside meaningful reform, urging lawmakers to ensure that incidents like his were not repeated. The political response was swift. Bills were drafted to require enhanced training on racial and cultural sensitivity, clearer protocols for home visits and stops, and independent review boards to oversee complaints against officers. News outlets covered every twist and turn, framing the legislation as a necessary response to a deeply troubling, very public incident. The debate sparked community engagement as well, with citizens attending town halls, writing letters to representatives, and participating in forums to advocate for change. For Marcus and his family, the experience was surreal. The private humiliation he endured had evolved into a catalyst for public action, demonstrating that individual courage and composure could resonate far beyond one household. His ordeal now served as a tangible example of why reform was not just a political talking point, but a moral and social imperative. As discussions continued, the weight of the moment was clear. One family's encounter with prejudice had ignited a movement, challenging entrenched norms and pushing the state toward meaningful reform. Marcus Carter's quiet dignity had sparked conversations, legislation, and awareness that would resonate long after the cameras had left and the headlines faded. The family. The day after the media storm and political uproar, the Carter household was quiet, yet heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Angela prepared breakfast with a careful, deliberate pace, her mind replaying the events, while Jasmine and David lingered near the table, their eyes still wide with a mixture of lingering fear and awe. Marcus, finally free from the constraints of the precinct, sat across from them, his posture relaxed yet commanding. a calm presence amidst the storm of emotions. He looked at his children, seeing in their eyes the echoes of the tension they had witnessed, fear, confusion, and questions too complex for their ages. "You both saw what happened last night," Marcus began, his voice gentle but steady. "You saw how people sometimes judge others before they understand the truth. You saw injustice. But you also saw something else, something far more important." Jasmine, still holding her small stuffed animal, whispered, "Daddy, why didn't they listen?" The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Because sometimes people act on assumptions, not facts. They let fear or bias guide them, instead of reason and fairness. But that doesn't mean we let them define us, or that we give up on standing for what is right. David, more curious than frightened, asked, "But were they scared of you?" Marcus smiled softly, shaking his head. "No, they weren't scared of me. They were acting on their own misunderstandings. That's why it's so important to stay calm, to stay composed, and to respond with dignity. Being angry or reacting without thought only gives them more power." Angela joined the conversation, placing a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Your father showed you tonight what true courage looks like. It isn't just about standing up to unfairness. It's about standing up with integrity, no matter how others treat you." Marcus nodded, letting the words sink in. He wanted his children to understand that dignity and self-respect were not negotiable, that true strength lay in controlling one's response in the face of adversity. He continued, "Life will not always be fair. People will make mistakes, act unjustly, or treat you poorly. But what matters is how you respond. You have the power to uphold your values, to speak your truth and to demand respect without compromising who you are." The children absorbed the lesson quietly, the gravity of the night settling into understanding. Marcus's ordeal had transformed from a moment of personal humiliation into a living example of resilience and principle. For the Carter family, the experience became a teaching moment, a vivid reminder that dignity, courage, and moral integrity are lessons best learned not through textbooks, but through life's trials. As they sat together, the room filled with a mix of relief, reflection, and determination. Marcus Carter's journey had been painful, humiliating, and unjust, but it had also imparted an invaluable lesson to the next generation. The fight for justice begins with oneself, and the principles we uphold define not just our lives, but the legacy we leave behind. The future. In the weeks following the incident, Marcus Carter channeled the frustration, humiliation, and disbelief of that night into purposeful action. The experience had left scars, emotional and psychological, but it had also ignited a determination to prevent others from enduring similar injustice. Marcus understood that personal endurance was not enough. Systemic change required public engagement, advocacy, and the unwavering assertion of legal principles. He began by speaking at community forums, recounting the events with clarity and calm authority. He emphasized not only the personal injustice he faced, but the broader implications for the community, urging citizens to hold institutions accountable while maintaining composure and dignity. His story resonated deeply. People saw the human cost of bias, and many were inspired to demand reform and better oversight. Simultaneously, Marcus partnered with civil rights organizations and legal advocacy groups, providing guidance on legislative initiatives and policy reforms. His insight was invaluable. He had first-hand experience of how assumptions and systemic flaws could play out in real life. With each meeting, each consultation, he helped shape programs for bias training, improved procedural protocols, and educational campaigns to foster understanding between law enforcement and the communities they served. At the state capitol, Marcus testified before committees, his presence commanding attention and respect. He spoke of accountability, integrity, and the need for laws to protect citizens not just in theory, but in practice. Legislators listened intently, recognizing that his experience was both a cautionary tale and a blueprint for reform. Bills were drafted, reviewed, and passed with Marcus's guidance. Laws that addressed racial profiling, police accountability, and the transparency of enforcement actions. Marcus also turned to education, giving lectures at law schools and civic workshops. He emphasized resilience, the importance of standing firm in one's principles, and the power of transforming adversity into constructive action. His message was clear: dignity is non-negotiable. Injustice is unavoidable at times, But meaningful change comes when individuals respond thoughtfully and persistently. Even in private moments with Angela and their children, Marcus reinforced the lessons learned from the ordeal. He explained that while fear, prejudice, and error would always exist in society, individuals have the capacity to respond with integrity, effecting real change in the world around them. He wanted Jasmine and David to carry these principles into their own lives, shaping not just their futures but the values of their community. The Carter family's home, once the site of humiliation and fear, became a symbol of resilience and advocacy. Marcus Carter's ordeal, transformed into a mission of action, demonstrated the extraordinary power of one individual to confront systemic flaws and drive tangible, lasting change. From trauma emerged purpose, and from injustice arose a renewed commitment to ensure that dignity, fairness, and justice were not just ideals but living, enforceable realities. Reflection. As the evening light filtered through the Carter household, Marcus sat quietly with Angela and the children, reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had transformed their lives. The humiliation, the media attention, the political debates, all of it had culminated in a lesson far greater than any courtroom or legislative chamber could offer. Marcus understood, as he always had, that true justice was not only about laws, but about the respect, dignity, and humanity we extend to one another. He looked at his children, seeing the same curiosity and determination that had driven him throughout his life. "Remember this," he said, voice calm but filled with conviction. "People may judge you, may misunderstand you, or even attempt to humiliate you, but your identity, your principles, and your integrity cannot be taken away. You define your worth, not their assumptions." The story of that night, the handcuffs, the disbelief, the shock of the officers as they realized whom they had detained, remained vivid in his mind. He thought about the irony, the bitter twist of fate. They had no idea they were handcuffing the man who wrote the very laws they enforced. It was a sobering reminder of the fragility of perception, the dangers of bias, and the importance of asserting oneself with dignity. Marcus had transformed the ordeal into action, public advocacy, legislative reform, community education. Yet the core lesson remained personal and universal. Injustice, no matter how systemic or pervasive, could be met with resilience, thoughtful response, and moral courage. The human spirit, when anchored in integrity, could withstand humiliation and inspire change, not only for oneself, but for the community at large. He glanced at Angela, who offered a reassuring smile, and at Jasmine and David, who listened intently. "This isn't just our story," Marcus continued. "It's a story for everyone. It's about holding firm to your values, demanding respect, and recognizing that every individual deserves dignity, no matter the assumptions made about them." The lesson echoed beyond their living room, reaching the broader community through news outlets, social media, and conversations sparked by the incident. Marcus Carter's experience became a beacon, reminding everyone that identity, justice, and humanity are inseparable. The title of the story, "The Moment That Captured the World's Attention," resonated like a refrain. They had no idea they were handcuffing the man who wrote the very laws they enforced. Finally, he stood, facing the camera of the household documentary crew, a quiet authority in his posture. "If this story teaches anything," he said, "let it be that dignity, integrity, and justice matter. Speak your truth, uphold your principles, and never let anyone define your worth." And with that, a subtle but powerful call to action. Subscribe, share, like, and comment, so that stories like Marcus Carter's continue to inspire awareness, accountability, and courage in communities everywhere.